couple of minutes just to
Yeah, we'll
see
just...
if people actually oh yeah.
Right.
The post.
Yeah, I can see it on the live. We've got 23 viewers. Okay, we're good to go.
Great.
All right. Kia ora everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Sorry for the technical difficulty. Had a bit of problem there. So tonight we are the Yes 2020 team, and we're hosting this event with Tom Sainsbury. And just to give you a little bit about us, we are a student-led campaign who are looking to get the yes vote in the upcoming referendum. And we're just here to kind of provide some facts, some statistics, and to pretty much empower people to have effective conversations about cannabis prohibition. Tom.
Great.
Yeah.
Shall I take over? Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Sainsbury. I feel that I'm amongst some great brains in this panel, and I'm really excited to be educated and to have great arguments for certain people when it comes to cannabis referendums and things. I'm just going to go around the panel and introduce you all. We'll start with Kylie. So Kylie, if you can wave for us. There we go. Kylie Quince is an Associate Professor of Law and the Director of Māori Pacific Advancement at AUT and a strong advocate for cannabis reform. Hi, Kylie.
Kia ora.
Then we've got Jack McDonald, if you just give us a wave. Between 2018 and 2019, Jack was the Māori Advocacy Advisor for the New Zealand Drug Foundation, so he's going to be bringing a lot of intel. Then we've got Ricardo Menendez up there. He is a Green Party 2020 candidate for Maunga Kiki and the coordinator for the Auckland Action Against Poverty. Then we've got Chloe Swarbrick, who became a sitting Green Party MP in 2017, is now ranked number 3 on the 2020 party list. Congrats, Chloe. And she is the party's spokesperson for drug law reform. And finally, we've got Dr. Rere Moana Theodore, and she's the co-director of the National Centre for Life Course Research, which I love going on to the website for that, Moana. And their studies focus on positive, sustainable health, well-being, and educational outcomes over time, which sounds amazing. I was wondering if we could just go around in that order and just talk for like 2 minutes around why this kind of topic. Why are you interested in this? Like, what are you hoping to gain from it and all that kind of stuff? So we'll start with Kylie. Maybe you could tell us your passion in this.
Kia ora tātou katoa, tēnei te mihi mahana kia koutou, ko Kylie tōku ingoa, he uri o Ngāpuhi me Ngāti Porou. Although that's yet to be fact-checked by Chloe's friend Nikki. So I'm Kylie. I wear 3 hats really in relation to this kaupapa of cannabis law reform. So in my professional life as a criminal justice advocate, and my personal identity is Māori, and thirdly, in terms of my life as a mum to 3 teenagers, all at high school, all in prime, the prime time of their life where they might start to tutu with drugs and alcohol and other substances. So each of those hats provide me with a different and clear rationale for supporting drug reform. So that includes racism and discrimination in terms of policing and criminal justice and law enforcement, providing health rather than justice responses for non-problematic use, which is most people. As a Māori, of course, we're talking about those discrimination aspects and unnecessary entry into criminal justice for young people in particular. As a mum and a person who's been on school boards for many years, I'm also particularly concerned about young people being disengaged from school, so being stood down purely because of the illegality of cannabis and the effects that has on young people's life pathways in terms of the ability to further their education, get jobs, keep jobs, travel, all of those things that people that don't have either cannabis convictions or aren't disengaged from school can do. So in terms of my interest in this work, I'm currently the Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Drug Foundation, the National Board, and I'm also a member of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisors Expert Advisory Group for the cannabis referendum. So a couple of different things which I'm happy to talk about as we go along. Kia ora.
Great, thank you so much. Jack?
Kia ora tātou, ka tautoko au ngā mihi kua mihia. He uri tēnei o Taranaki Maunga, Taranaki Tangata, Taranaki Iwi. Whakawhiti atu rā ki a pōtaki mai tawhiti he uri o te whakatohia hoki. Kia ora everyone, so Jack McDonald. As Tom said, I worked at the New Zealand Drug Foundation for about a year as their Māori advocacy advisor and worked alongside amazing people like Kylie. And through that work, I helped plan the Māori campaign for the referendum, but I also worked quite closely on our submission to the government around the detail of the legislation and the regulations. And so one thing that I'm really have been really interested in over the last few days in preparation for this meeting is reading through the through the proposed legislation. And although, as I'm sure Chloe will tell us, it's not perfect, I was actually really impressed with what was in it. And they did meet a number of the recommendations we were asking for. So I'm keen to talk about that tonight, but I'm also keen to, having grown up in cannabis using and cannabis producing communities, and I don't just mean Māori communities either, I'm keen to bring that perspective to the kōrero tonight in terms of how legalisation actually honours the survivors of the war on drugs and also communities who survive on cannabis, both economically and medically. Kia ora.
Great, awesome. Ricardo?
Oh, kia ora. So yeah, I'm Ricardo. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Mexico. I've been in Aotearoa since 2006. And I guess to me, the connection to this kaupapa is, like many of the people here, is my own lived experience. I grew up in one of the epicenters of the war on drugs. And growing up both in a cannabis-consuming household, but also in school where, you know, the stories of having classmates or parents of my classmates who were murdered by the cartels or affected by the war on drugs was a common thing. And so I guess I bring that perspective that the war on drugs is a global one. And in my day job, I work with people on the benefit, predominantly Māori and Pacific communities who are continuously stigmatized and discriminated against due to our laws, but also our culture around drugs. And so I'm particularly passionate about making sure that, as Jack said, our move towards legalization honors those survivors, but doesn't entrench inequities around who has access to the production. I think there's genuine concern from people who have subsisted on the growing and the selling of cannabis. And I'm really pleased that the new this legislation will address quite a few of those things. So that's me.
Great, awesome. Chloe?
Kia ora tātou e te whānau. So I'm Chloe Swarbrick. I am a Green MP based in Auckland Central in the we have very few MPs. We've got 8 around our caucus table, so I end up juggling a bunch of portfolios, but the one that's most pertinent to tonight is in drug law reform. So I have been working closely with particularly the Minister of Justice and of course with our colleagues in New Zealand First, and of late wrangling as well members of the opposition and the cross-party group formed to come to a final consensus and release this final legislation, which is why we didn't necessarily get everything we wanted, but I really want to talk what's been said by both Jack and Ricardo with regard to how it is a heck of a lot better than it could have been, and it's also a heck of a lot better than the status quo. So I understand we're later going to touch on what those components are, but I guess kind of as a bit of a foreshadowing of all of that as to why I'm so interested in this. You know, I am a Pākehā kid from a pretty working class, but we muddled through and kind of got middle class and then went very much back to working class backgrounds. I have, you know, I'm the first person in my family to have gone to university, but I also went to a really fancy school. And as a result of the privilege of the schools and the kids who we were around, you know, drugs were really prevalent, particularly cannabis. And it was never that there was any kind of concern around people being arrested for it. And that's the real big mythology that I'm kind of really interested in busting here, is that the war on drugs isn't a war on drugs. It's a war on the poor. It's a war on Māori. It's a war on marginalized communities. And it fundamentally is about upholding mythologies around essentially quite racist notions. And that's why I think it's really important that we recognize that this isn't just an opportunity to reduce harm and improve well-being in our communities, but also to undo some of those systemic historical injustices and ensure that we don't end up with a system like what happened in the United States, for example, where a number of states have seen very different demographics profiting from a legal model as those who were penalized, criminalized, and actually some of which are still serving criminal sentences under a prohibitionist approach.
Great. And finally, Moana?
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Moana te roto ingoa ngō Ngāpuhi me te arawa oku iwi. Thanks for having me. My name's Moana. I grew up in South Auckland, so a lot of my whānau still live there. But I now live in Dunedin, where I'm an academic, and I co-direct as Tom said, the Centre for Life Course Research. And so that's in part how I got interested in cannabis issues. And in particular, I'm interested in issues for Māori youth. And so from a work perspective, I've worked on and worked with the Dunedin and the Christchurch longitudinal studies. And quite a lot of what we know about cannabis and its impacts on young people in New Zealand come from those studies in terms of health and well-being. And so ahead of the referendum, we, myself and other colleagues, including Tuari Portaki of the Drug Foundation, talked about maybe putting some information together to look at some of the impacts of cannabis on Māori youth specifically. And we've just had a paper published about that, which I'll hopefully get to talk a little bit about tonight. And the other reason I got interested in this area was, I guess, similar to Kylie. I've got 3 kids, and they're aged 18, 12, and 10. And so was in discussions with them. My daughter is 18. She goes to Otago University, and she'll be voting for the first time this year. And I was aware that, you know, her and I and other young rangatahi in my whānau were having conversations about cannabis and its impacts, but there were other whānau that wouldn't necessarily have that type of information, and so how to go about sharing some of that with other whānau and the wider community, so that they were informed about cannabis ahead of the vote. So yeah, it's lovely to be here.
Right. And can we assume that you're also a gamer, Moana?
I know. Well, I couldn't get the computer to work beforehand, so my whānau say this looks like I'm gaming. So yeah, I know I'm the only one with headsets, but hopefully you can hear me. So
it's great. And can I just commend you all? The last panel I did, everyone talked for like 20 minutes. I'm like trying to find a little breath to jump in. So thank you for being succinct. I'm going to pass you over to Joe and Bridget now.
Hello everyone, thank you. So all right, let's get stuck into it then.
Yeah.
Chloe, would you be able to give us a brief overview of the bill so far?
Yeah, for sure. So the bill was finalised only a few weeks ago and released in the public realm. So it's actually now no longer a matter of politicking inside of Parliament. And I think that offers a really exciting opportunity to kind of cut through the BS and to hopefully hand over to voices the likes of Health Not Handcuffs, obviously the likes of Yul and the Yes 2020 campaign, those in Health Not Handcuffs, Iwi and Hapu, as well as the likes of Normal and the campaign that they've kind of built around Vote Yes. So we've approached this entire legislation from the starting points that we need to recognise that there is a difference between a substance and the approach that you can have to that substance. So we can recognise that a substance by itself can potentially cause harm, particularly if misused. If you recognise that as the premise, the next question has to become, how do you implement legal frameworks that increase or could perversely actually end up decreasing that harm? So it's a focus on decreasing the harm as opposed to increasing it. And that is where we have come up with some really cool criteria, which are manifested and fleshed throughout in about 150 pages of law, which we can drill through on, but I'll hand it over to my former law lecturer to get into that detail later. But just off the kind of top, the really core points to know is that there will be a purchasing age limited to those over the age of 20. There will be absolute ban on advertising and on sponsorship, which obviously kind of impedes any attempt to glamorize or to normalize consumption of the substance, particularly to excess. There will also be preferential licensing, particularly for Māori, iwi and hapu, and to make sure that we again begin to address that historical harm through the criminalised model, that we have a focus on reducing harm. That also requires there to be labelling on the products as they're sold. There will also be a limit on the amounts that you can purchase every day. That's 14 grams, and it's really funny when this information kind of came out into the public. I was having a discussion with one of my policy advisors who was like, hey, why did we put a limit on the amounts that you could buy on a daily basis? Because when you put that limit on the amount, all of a sudden the discussion becomes about how much you can actually buy. And I remember this News Hub piece coming out and saying that it was the equivalent of like a grapefruit of cannabis that you could buy every day, because that's just the way that we end up talking in these really sensationalist frames. But no one's talking about how you can go to a liquor store and buy infinite bottles of vodka. So anyway, there is a limit on how much you can buy. There is also provision for personal cultivation. That was really important for me and for those who have worked in harm reduction, also particularly from the perspectives that I heard coming out of Indigenous leadership across Canada and America. When I went to the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna last year, because of the recognition, as Ricardo may be able to speak to, with these Indigenous populations, particularly actually out of places like Mexico, who have utilized this substance in a way that hasn't been mega pharmaceuticalized or for so-called recreational purposes. And yeah, just fully and finally, it is about enabling us to create a framework that we can then control, place some form of excise on, and in turn reinvest that back into harm reduction.
Great. Succinct. It sounds awesome. Everyone should vote yes. I've got a couple of questions that people watching have already sent in some questions to ask. So I'll start with one for you, Kylie. Why has prohibition not worked, and why doesn't prohibition work?
Sure. So in terms of the way that the criminal law works, the criminal law tends to work by prohibiting things. And as Chloe's talked about, a prohibition approach in relation to a substance is a really poor way of trying to regulate or control people's behaviour. So it hasn't worked, and we know that it hasn't worked. So a prohibition-based law is really easy. All it says is don't touch that thing, don't do that thing in terms of behaviour, don't go to that place. So you're relying upon a lot of social cohesion and agreed sort of morality if you want to abide by that kind of prohibition approach. It hasn't worked in relation to cannabis. And we know that because all the data says that, and Wana could tell us more about that, all the data says most adult New Zealanders have tried cannabis at some stage. That means that they're not dissuaded by the fact of its illegality. They probably have also not had a formalised legal response, meaning that they've gotten into trouble for using cannabis. So it hasn't worked because people have been able to use it. It means that it's relatively easily accessible. Most people would know how to get hold of DAC. You can tell my age because I say DAC, if they needed to. So that means it hasn't worked. The cost, it's also not worked because the cost to our criminal justice system has been huge. In terms of human costs, there are still people that are imprisoned solely for possession of cannabis. So in 2019, there were 41 people in prison in New Zealand solely because of possession of cannabis. So so a lot of people have said, Paula Bennett being one of them. When I went to meet with the National Party caucus to talk about this last year, she said, oh no, but effectively this has been decriminalised for 20 years. So in the mid to late 1990s, the police changed their approach. So they changed their approach to say, well, the Misuse of Drugs Act said this. Nobody abides by that in relation to cannabis. So the police decided to change their approach. That's really problematic for a lawyer to think about in terms of rule of law. The police aren't supposed to make the law. Parliament makes the law. That's why we vote for Chloe. That's why we're going to vote for Ricardo. So that approach is really problematic. So this is an attempt to do this honestly, if you like, which is to be very upfront. The other reason it didn't work is because, although I've said the police changed their approach in the 1990s, so you can see that prosecution and policing of low-level possessory offences for cannabis, so being caught with a joint or a couple of joints, prosecutions completely dived over that 20-year period. So very few people are now, given a formal justice response to possession. However, the people that did get a formal response were young people, males, and brown people. So in New Zealand, if you add all of those factors together, young male Māori generally are those people who continued to have the actual formal aspects of the Misuse of Drugs Act, policed against them as a demographic. Also hugely expensive in terms of taxpayer dollars, so hundreds of millions of dollars in enforcement. All of my relatives in Hokianga, and I'm sure Jackson, Taranaki and elsewhere, can tell you what time of year the helicopters start to arrive. So the policing and enforcement costs hundreds of millions of dollars that could otherwise be reinvested, as Chloe mentioned, into health-based responses. But health-based responses only for people that need it. So the other reason it's been ineffective and why people don't really respect the law is that it's not particularly harmful. It's not harmfully used by the majority of people. So, the overwhelming majority of people do not use cannabis in the same way that they do not use alcohol to problematic levels. So it was really using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So hopefully we can, readjust that. So it was incredibly expensive in dollar terms. It was ineffective in terms of being dissuasive to people. It didn't control their behaviour, and it did control the behaviour only in racist and discriminatory ways against certain groups. So it was really ineffective for a number of reasons, and that's why this 40-year-old piece of legislation, has to go.
Great. That was a great answer. Ricardo, you're up next. Other than imprisonment, how are communities affected by cannabis prohibition?
Yeah, so I think for me, what I see at the front lines is the flow-on effects of the prohibition of cannabis and the criminalization of cannabis. And it flows on into quite a few areas of welfare and housing. And I think there's two examples in how this affected in those areas. One of them is our sanctions regime in the welfare system, and the fact that we have this sanction that if you fail a drug test as a beneficiary, you get your income cut. And so often, again, it's this idea, it's a punitive approach where we think that by removing somebody's income, you'll dissuade them from consuming a substance, and we know that that doesn't work. In fact, if you leave somebody without 100% of the income or even 50% of the income, what you push them towards is homelessness and potentially more harmful substances. And similarly to our imprisonment rates around cannabis, the drug testing sanction is applied predominantly to Māori. And this drug testing sanction has some sort of discretion into it. So a work and income case manager can choose to cut your income or not. They can still say no. And so this is where the biases really, really show. And another one is around the clauses and the reasons you can get evicted from social housing. And one of the reasons that is still in place is the so-called antisocial behavior. And often that it's super arbitrary. It can mean so many things. But a great example of what our current system will classify as antisocial behavior would be things like, using cannabis. You can dob in your neighbor for antisocial behavior if they live in social housing, and they may get evicted for that, right? And so I think it's this whole culture of the taboo, the prohibition, the criminalization that actually affects so many other laws and policies by government, which end up impacting who? Like Chloe said, so it ends up being a war on the poor, a war on brown people. And I think it's really important that as we look towards the referendum and the legalization, we also look at reforming other areas in our system that have been so entrenched by this culture of prohibition. And the effect is homelessness, by the way, on the latter, the second one. It actually leaves people homeless, which is not how you fix an issue of addiction or harmful use of substance.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ricardo. Moana, I've got a question for you. How will cannabis affect the health of youth? And what recommendations do you have to support their well-being?
Yeah, so and I think the discussion has already, there's been some discussion in and around harm reduction. So what the research tells us is that regular, early, so talking early to mid-adolescence use of cannabis is not without its harms. So there are some harms, and that using cannabis regularly at a young age, say 13, 14, 50, has been associated with some mental health issues, for example, psychosis, particularly if a young person has a family history of these issues. And that's why when we think about things like age restrictions being important as we discuss the legalization of cannabis, because we know that young people, as opposed to older people, are more susceptible to some of those effects of cannabis because of the developing adolescent brain. That said, I think it's really important to note, and as we talk about in our research, that these types of harms of cannabis occur whether or not cannabis is legal or illegal. So, and I think Kylie's touched upon some points here and others in terms of, the impacts, or their work's touched upon the impacts of how arrests and convictions can also impact on people's health and well-being as well, and their lives. So, for example, difficulty gaining employment. And the other thing that the longitudinal studies have told us in particular, and this has also been discussed, and it was the Christchurch study that showed us that there were inequities not only in terms of cannabis use for young people, but also in terms of their convictions. So that Māori youth, they found, were not only more likely to use cannabis for a number of reasons, but even if those higher rates were taken into account, they were more likely to be arrested and convicted on cannabis charges. So if they were using the same amount as their mates, but they were more likely to be arrested and convicted. What the Christchurch study also showed us was it found that actually being arrested or convicted on a cannabis charge didn't actually stop people from continuing to use cannabis. So I think it was nearly 95% of those arrested or convicted continued to use cannabis at a similar or an increased rates. So making it illegal wasn't working in terms of dropping the use. And so, based on that evidence, what we've talked about has been in and around cannabis being treated as a health issue, which is, I think, what we've been talking about here, and not a criminal issue. Because for young people, and we're talking about the effects, you asked me about the effects of cannabis with youth, for young people, it's about having that access to education in and around what the impacts of cannabis are, what the potential harms are, and also access to healthcare, so that they can get, if they are having issues in terms of cannabis, their cannabis use or dependence, that they're able to access treatment without the stigma or barriers to getting that help. So really, for when we think about young people, when we think about life course, we're thinking about prevention, and we're thinking about early intervention and treatment in terms of young people being able to get help and being able to have those conversations with them.
Great, thanks, Moana. I've got a question for you, Jack. What do you think Parliament should be doing to ensure more vulnerable communities and those already a part of the cannabis community are not excluded from the process if the legalisation is passed?
Kia ora, Tom. Thank you for that question. And that is something I wanted to talk about tonight, because although I'll be absolutely voting yes in the referendum, encouraging my friends and whānau to vote yes for, mainly the reasons that Moana actually just outlined, because I think, you know, from a health perspective, undeniably legalization is the best way to go, but also based on the strength of the bill. And I think that the bill has a number of provisions in it, some of which have already been mentioned, that I think that go at least some part to addressing my concerns around ensuring that communities who are currently involved in cannabis production in particular actually don't suffer economically as a result of legalization. You know, particularly Māori communities, but not just Māori communities, and particularly in rural places like Taitokerau, like Tairāwhiti, like Taranaki, you know, illicit cannabis production is a huge part of the economy, and a huge part of the economy for parts of our communities who are most vulnerable. And so one of the things I was particularly pleased to see was the preferential licensing and a quota being put in place for small scale growing, and a cap, I think, of 20% on any one company. So, you know, it's really important that we prevent monopolies and prevent the takeover of big cannabis, essentially, the corporates from overseas. And so when I was with the Drug Foundation, I had the privilege of going to Canada for a First Nations conference on cannabis. And one of the things that our whanaunga from Canada made really clear was that, one, they talked a lot about the takeover of it from a corporate perspective and the difficulties of them being involved in the legal market, which they wanted to get into. But two, they talked about how, because they hadn't engaged early enough, or the Crown in their country hadn't engaged with them early enough, they were really left out of the regulations. And so I was pleased to see at least some provision in the law. And I saw, for example, so there's going to be the Cannabis Regulatory Authority, I think it's called, set up, Chloe will correct me if I'm wrong, set up as a result of the legislation, and supporting that a Cannabis Advisory Committee. And I was pleased to see that iwi and Māori will be representative on the Cannabis Advisory Committee. I think that's crucially important. But I also think that it's important that we ensure that those with actually expertise and experience in the cannabis industry are also reflected or represented, both on the authority and on the advisory committee. And I think that in terms of, so I guess my main point here is that we need to stay vigilant and continue to campaign for some of these things to actually happen. And so the one that I think of most predominantly is quashing previous cannabis-related convictions. And I think that it's absolutely crucial that not just for possession and use of cannabis, but also for production, cultivation, and sale, that we actually do wipe the convictions of people who, as Kylie was talking about, have been caught up in the criminal justice system. One thing I was really pleased to see in the legislation is that the fit and proper test doesn't exclude those people from the industry. And I imagine, and I want to really mahi to Chloe and the Drug Foundation, everyone who I'm sure pushed for these things, because I imagine it wasn't easy. But that's critical, because actually, if we're talking about the dangers of the black market, and I have some, I think some of that rhetoric is quite problematic, but you know, if you're talking in that way, then actually you need to have a plan in place to transition people from the illicit market into the legal market, because these people, you know, my whanaunga and my friends, they have incredible skills. This is, you know, this is their way of life, and this is their job. And but even on that issue, we had to stay vigilant. So, you know, there was restrictions around if you had other drug offences, or if you're a member of a criminal organisation, for example. Now, to me, that's targeted at gangs, and we should not be excluding gang members from the legal market either, because actually, you know, we all, one, gangs aren't necessarily criminal organisations, but two, people involved in gangs, we want to be able to ensure that they can get a piece of the legal market as well, so they don't necessarily need to rely on criminal activity. So I've talked about a lot there, but I guess my main point is that even once legislation has passed, legalization, which I'm really hope that it does, we're going to continue to need to campaign to quash previous convictions, to ensure that small-scale existing growers can take part in the legal market, and that we don't allow the monopolization of big cannabis. Kia ora.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Jack. Chloe, why is legalization better than decriminalization in this instance?
Great question, Tom. It's funny, right? Because I hear there's been all these billboards which folks who are in Tamaki Makaurau or in Canterbury, and I'm not sure if there's been any in Wellington, but there's been these big billboards up with Family First saying you can't talk about mental health and legalization of cannabis at the same time. Sorry guys, you can and you have to, particularly if your argument is that there is association between the two. We know, for example, from the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry, which is released last year, reflective of screeds and screeds of contemporary research, essentially demonstrates that you can have underlying biological predisposition, particularly towards mental ill health, but the environment or circumstances that you are in can either aggravate or mitigate, i.e. increase or decrease the potential for the manifestation of that mental ill health or propensity towards addiction or escapism. And those kind of major driving factors largely center around poverty and the stress of your life, but they are also the likes of isolation and trauma. Just so happens that right now, our major response to people who are experiencing trouble with substances is to further isolate and traumatize them through the criminal justice system. I also, just before I get to the major distinction between decriminalization and legalization, want to touch on Jack's point, which is really critical. Do not leave this to politicians. No meaningful change ever comes from the top down. It must come from the ground up, and that is how you build a mandate for political change. You know, our parliament is not the kind of system that you would want to design if it was capable of responding to these massive challenges that we face, and it is still an inherently colonial adversarial system which has got multifaceted problems. But to unpack all of that, on the Jack point around the need for expungement, ultimately, I'll be straight up and say that that's what we, the Greens, fought for. We fought for full expungement, and unfortunately we didn't get that. As the kind of middle road that we did get, we managed to get that explicit requirement in the legislation that those with past convictions for low-level cannabis offences could not be barred from entering into the legal industry. And again, that's about an attempt to try and get people from that illicit economy into the legal economy, because the whole purpose of this is to move those communities who have historically been alienated and discriminated against and rejected into a space that is actually embraced and really actually a part of something that we celebrate in terms of innovation and otherwise. So the thing about decriminalization, so we'll think of it like a spectrum, right? You've got criminalization, decriminalization, and then legalization. That's often how people think about it. In criminalization, under a prohibitionist model, you are dealing with it as bluntly as a criminal issue. You are not winding in the factors of housing, as Ricardo was speaking about, of income, of education, of employment, of opportunity writ large. You are solely dealing with it as a criminal issue, which means that you cut off all of the other potential avenues to solve potential problems as they emerge. So when you take away that criminal element and you move into the sphere of decriminalization, then more opportunities become available to you. But decriminalization is fundamentally about removing the penalties, particularly if you're thinking about the Portugal type of model, for people who use the substance. And Portugal is a model that's regularly kind of quoted to me, and I find this really useful and interesting, particularly when applied to some of the more harmful substances. But even then, I could go on a massive tangent around Switzerland's approach to heroin in the 1990s. We're not going to do that. Decriminalization is literally just about removing those penalties for people who use. But if you really investigate the Portugal model, it actually ends up looking slightly Orwellian with this commission of dissuasion that they have. So if you are found to be using or in possession of any illicit substance under decriminalized model in Portugal, you go in front of this so-called panel of experts and this commission of dissuasion. And they basically have to dissuade you from using that substance. And they also have recourse, especially if you continue coming up in front of that commission, to eventually put you in jail. So it basically doesn't actually get rid of fully and finally the issue of criminalization, and it doesn't properly open those doors either with regard to investment, particularly away from the criminal justice sector into housing, health, and otherwise. it also doesn't deal with the issue of supply. And this was a major kind of problem with regard to the first iteration of the government's medicinal cannabis bill. When you solely remove penalties for people who are using a substance, how are they supposed to get that substance? You are still effectively making somebody in that supply chain a criminal. But on top of that, you are not imposing any duty of care, which I'm sure Kylie could talk about at length. You're not imposing any duty of care on the person who is supplying it, which means that you have no idea what the potency or the quality of the substance is that somebody's getting. But on top of that, you know, the classic line, drug dealers don't typically check ID. So what you are looking at when you are investigating, actually moving from this model of decriminalisation into legalisation, is greater control over the supply chain, the implementation of the duty of care, and therefore opportunities to intervene, particularly in problematic use, which you don't get when people are pushed into the shadows. Under both a decriminalised and a criminalised model, anything bar a legalised model, you are still pushing users and the people who are supplying them into the shadows. You have unknown people in unknown places consuming products of unknown quality and to unknown ends. And what really blows me away about all of this, Tom, particularly given that you've had, you know, for example, Moana and Kylie, both speaking to the fact that we have 80% of New Zealanders using cannabis by the time they're 21 years old in this country. You've also got politicians who go on shows that used to exist, like backbenchers, admitting to having used cannabis, you know, back in the mists of time, but it didn't ruin their life. Why are we still willing to sit back and accept that those 41 people should be in prison for something that a majority of people in this country have done? But worse than that, why are we willing to accept the hypocrisy of politicians willing to enforce criminalisation, penalisation, and ripping away the future of people who are doing exactly the same thing that they have done? It's ludicrous. You can't say hypocrisy in Parliament, but I've said as much as I can to that effect. So yeah, in a nutshell, basically to Jack's point as well, I always get in trouble for trying to explain this on camera, but basically there is this thing called the harm reduction curve. And on the one axis, you've got the level of harm that can come about. And on the other axis, you've got the spectrum of kind of legal through to illegal. And when you have an illicit illegal market that is controlled by, as Jack says, it's problematic terminology, but just for shorthand, the black market under complete prohibition, you have the potential peak of the harm. It's like a U. On the other side of the peak of the harm, you have a complete just unregulated free market that is essentially highly commercialized. And in both of those situations, you have a circumstance whereby there are entities that exist to exploit vulnerable communities in order to make a quick buck. Where you manage to minimize that harm, kind of in the bottom of the U, for lack of a better term, is in the realm of regulation. And you don't get those controls or those tools for regulation unless you are willing to legalize.
Great. You guys are so smart.
We're Snapchat guy, Tom. No, you were smart as well, bro.
We're going to go to, people are asking questions as we go, but I'm going to start with my question that I really want an answer to. So whenever, I kind of try and explain it, why I'd vote yes and stuff, I always say alcohol is a lot worse and people do it anyway. But those both come from essentially a negative spin. I was wondering if you could give me some kind of positive layman sound bites, like one sentence or positive things about legalizing cannabis that I could throw at people.
We're going to legalize cannabis a lot better than we legalized alcohol. A far better kind of comparison, although it also has problems with it, is akin to tobacco. And the problem with regard to kind of tobacco and the regulations around that is that there has been excises, taxes levied on it beyond the point of efficacy, particularly for reducing harm amongst the most vulnerable and most marginalized communities. And that's as a result of kind of an economic term called sin taxes, where we recognize that there are other tools that are in the toolkit of the government, whether it's education or cessation devices or otherwise. But basically, we haven't regulated alcohol properly. Alcohol is still able to be advertised. It's still able to be a massive sponsor of sports across the country. And actually in 2014, there was a report commissioned by the then national government, led by a guy everyone tells me is involved in rugby called Graham Lowe, who recommended that we do a bunch of different things through legal regulation to reduce harm of alcohol. Both major parties have rejected it. There's actually only one party in Parliament that has a consistent line on all substances in terms of reducing harm by the best regulations that are available for them, and that's the Greens. So it is that we haven't regulated alcohol properly, but it's still a lot better a scenario than would have occurred under prohibition.
Any positive, why is cannabis good?
I mean, I don't want to say why is cannabis good so much as I want to say, like, I think I draw a lot from my own experience when I talk to people about why yes. And as I mentioned at the beginning, despite the negative sort of stuff around Tijuana and the city that I grew up in, the household I was raised in was a household that didn't really use alcohol, but actually my parents were cannabis users. And they were always very open about the use of cannabis and in general of the history with substances. And I mean, to me, it was almost like growing in a household where this utopia of what society would look like if we actually all could have these conversations from a health approach, as opposed to this like taboo aspect. And the effect that it had on me, to be honest, is that not only did I reach high school knowing way more about drugs than most of my peers, which meant that I actually didn't fall for the myths and the misinformation, but it took so much of the sexiness away from it. Like, it wasn't this like sexy taboo issue that I, like consuming cannabis, I actually found it kind of lame. And I became this like incredibly sober like kid over like high school and through most of my early 20s. And when I finally tried cannabis in my mid 20s, like for the first time, I did it like on my own accord. And like, it was kind of not out of pressure, out of like this sort of taboo or thrill seeking sensation. It was just because the opportunity came up and I had all the information. And I think one of the positives of legalization is that hopefully more people will have a similar experience where their interactions with substances is based on information, that they have a safe space when they do try substances, and that we limit the negative experiences that people have with drugs. Because like Chloe said, most of us will have consumed cannabis over the course of our lifetime at least once, right? And hopefully that experience is not one that is traumatizing, is one that is, I guess, one based on information and facts and for your own well-being.
Yes, Jack.
Jump in here too. Thanks, Tom. And I can attest to Ricardo being an incredibly sober person. He won't even have a drink with me. But anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to add, I guess, and Kylie talks about this all the time. If there was no other reason to legalize or decriminalize cannabis other than keeping people out of prison and out of the criminal justice system, then that would be enough. And Chloe talked earlier around the importance of legalization as opposed to decriminalization, and I agree with that. And I'd also mention that actually a lot of the decrim models don't decriminalize production and sale, only possession, and so actually a lot of people would still continue to be criminalized anyway. And I think that it might be hard for some people who haven't had friends or family or people that they know caught up in that system, but for those of us that have, that is just huge. And Kylie mentioned there's something like 40 people in jail for cannabis possession alone, but there's a lot more, for cannabis production and sale. And then there's even more who, the cannabis aspect is one part of their charge that increases their prison sentence or their criminal conviction. And we know how damaging criminal convictions can be, even if you don't go to prison. They limit your ability to travel, they limit your ability to get good jobs, they limit your ability to get loans. So and also, of course, as we were talking about earlier, the health effects, the social stigma, and the inability to get help for the mental challenges that you might have. All of these reasons, I think, are some of the most compelling for why we should legalize. And one thing I would just say finally this bill isn't perfect, this approach isn't perfect, but it's what we've got on the table. And if we don't pass this bill and vote yes in this referendum, then we're going to miss the opportunity for a whole nother generation. And I think that once we pass it, we'll have the opportunity to improve things, and a lot of the regulation hasn't actually been decided yet. That will be decided by the regulatory authority. So I think it's really important, even if people have reservations, whether it's from a conservative perspective or whether it's from a cannabis using or producing perspective, I think those things can be worked out, but we actually just have to get it passed first.
Great.
Can I jump
Thanks,
in?
Jack. I'm just going to quickly jump in there and just say it's 8:30 now. Are you guys all right? Because we started a bit late to go to 8:45. Is that okay? 15 more minutes?
Sure.
Great. Sorry. Take it away, Kylie.
So I'll just say a couple of things. So,
Yes.
wearing my mama hat, I think.
Good.
So, if I wanted to answer your question directly, Tom, so my positive framing would be this: is that a yes vote is a vote for control. A yes vote is a vote for control. So
Great.
a couple of things we haven't mentioned yet is that this is only a vote to legalise the organic plant of cannabis. So we're not going for consumables. So if we're thinking, as a mama, I'm wanting to convince my own mother, who's very conservative, but also, the Karens down at Countdown. That's who I'm thinking about. The Karens at Countdown with teenage kids who are potentially concerned about their children. It will still be illegal for your children to consume cannabis. That there is currently really no, everybody's in the same boat currently, but there's very strong messaging in this bill. It's legalisation and control. So children and young people under 20 will not be able to legally consume cannabis. It can only be consumed in private. So you cannot consume cannabis in any public spaces. There will still be formal legal responses to people who break the rules. So consumption in public, sharing with young people under 20, and going over the daily limit, for example. So control also in terms of the product that you're getting, so the strength of the product. So we're moving into a regulated space where currently there is no regulation under a prohibition regime. So to the Karens out there, I'd say if you want to protect your young people and your children, then a vote yes is a vote for control and regulation, so that you know exactly what is allowed and what isn't allowed and what the consequences will be. But I know that if my kids do tutu with cannabis as young people, I don't want them to have to carry around the stigma and all of the corollary consequences that come with conviction for the rest of their lives. That is unfair, and it's disproportionate to the harm that is caused. So vote yes is a vote for control.
Lovely and succinct line too. Good, I'll use that one. I'm going to throw to Jo and to Bridget for the next question.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, Moana might actually have something really valuable to contribute, particularly with regard to the kind of equivalences around alcohol and cannabis.
Yeah, I was actually going to jump in on the mum thing, but you moved to. So I just wanted to tautoko what Ricardo said about being able to discuss with your kids the effects, and I suppose that's important, but also being able to discuss with other parents as well. And I would say the same, Kylie, similar. Like if your kids do experiment, and we know that nearly 4 out of 5, if we go with the longitudinal data, so up 80% have tried cannabis, and so it's about do you want your children to be faced with those sorts of things, and that's what the current system is. And I also, I guess for me, I'm really passionate about thinking about whānau Māori and knowing that it has been, in the past, the cannabis laws have been administered in a racially biased way, and that Māori kids have been more likely to be arrested and convicted, as I said, if they were using the same amount as their mates. And so as Māori, do we really want our rangatahi to continue to be affected by this type of inequitable treatment? And that has been something that's, that I've really considered as a Māori mum. And I'm really glad, actually, Chloe, you mentioned about the environmental factors that impact on cannabis. And, the He Ara Oranga report talks about substance use occurring in this wider social and political and economic context contexts, you know, that include things like colonization, include things like oppression, include things like economic hardship, and being able to understand that for our whānau Māori and for our Māori communities, I think is really important. The other thing I'd say, and thinking about having these discussions with my mum friends up the road at Countdown, is that, you know, there's been some recent studies in Canada and the United States that suggest that legalization may not actually increase adolescent cannabis use. But I do think it's incumbent on us, and I'm not just saying this because I'm a researcher, to keep monitoring that those use in our young people. I know the youth surveys do look at cannabis, and I think it's really important as this progresses that we keep a watchful eye in terms of our rangatahi and what they're doing. So I wanted to jump in on that part, but yeah.
Great, thanks, Moana. Joe and Bridget? Oh.
We just wanted to jump in quickly. We've had quite a few questions asking if the bill takes into account the number of people who may be drug tested at any time. So, you know, workplace drug testing, roadside drug testing. So,
so those are occurring in different pieces of legislation. So workplace testing is definitely going to be figured out. But what is really important is the signal that we are sending here about the critical distinction between impairment and something registering in your system. So I think there has been a lot of kind of dubious ways of people being, for example, thrown out of work, and obviously the kinds of drug testing that is being required of beneficiaries in the past and what have you that Ricardo has spoken to. And whilst I don't think that anybody should ever be removed of their income for having used an illicit substance, particularly when sometimes that is a form of self-medication, potentially also demonstrative of how they need a better life. What we actually are talking about here is that someone doesn't need to be impaired for cannabis to be showing up in their system. So it's the equivalent, you know, with cannabis. When you have used cannabis, it can show up, as we know, via data in your system for up to approximately 30 days or so. To say that somebody can't be doing their job even the next day after having consumed cannabis is ludicrous based on the data. But nonetheless, it will continue to be prevalent in somebody's system for that time. So we know that roadside testing is still also a moving feast, and better technology is ever being developed. The Associate Minister for Transport, Julian Genter, is working on that. But I think it's also really important for people to know that there is a massive distinction as well, in that currently, driving impaired is illegal. We are not legalizing driving impaired. In fact, we are only creating better tools to deal with people driving impaired and providing a basis for education about what it means to be impaired. So people will take risks, and they will be risks without educational information in a prohibitionist type model. Whereas what we are proposing is that information, is that education, so that people don't take those kinds of risks.
Great. What's going to happen to if it gets passed and stuff, what will happen to the 41 people in prison? Like, has that been discussed?
Kylie, what happens to them?
I'm afraid they're still there. So, of course, the normal way that laws work prospectively, of course, they only work in relation to things that are going to happen in the future. So, it's hard luck. It's very unusual to have laws operate retrospectively, so that people that are currently affected by them will have their status changed in any way, whether that's conviction quashed or expunged or their sentence commuted. So as we've discussed a bit, there is some talk about expungement. That should still be an ongoing conversation about, we've done expungement in a couple of other ways in recent years in New Zealand. So that shouldn't be off the table. But as Chloe said, sort of one step at a time in terms of...
Yeah, unfortunately, the situation is such that they will serve out their sentences. We would hope that they are not all too much longer. But also I would hope that off the back of this, there is actually a call for greater advocacy and for the incredible mahi that's been undertaken, for example, by People Against Prisons, by Just Speak, to go in there and to communicate the plight of these people who are serving these sentences, and hopefully to push for better change. In terms of the historical record on stuff that has finally become legalised and then there has been expungement, the most recent example is on homosexual law reform. So the men who received convictions for sodomy under those grotesque laws which made it illegal to be gay, finally, years and years after homosexuality was no longer an offence in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it was only a year or two ago, I was in Parliament when we passed the expungement. And what I've been told by officials in the Ministry of Justice is that we still have quite an analogue, quite a manual system for how we go about the process of expungement. So it's not as simple as like pressing the delete button on the computer. So people still have to proactively apply for that expungement, which again, I think is demonstrative of the need for ever greater law change. So it's important to recognize that this is just the start of the journey, but it is a really massive, critical start in terms of the cultural change that it will also facilitate around compassion and around the fact that, you know, criminalizing people, locking them away and perpetuating these mythologies around the poor or the lazy is not useful at all, and it's also kind of inherently racist.
And if I could just jump in really quickly to support Chloe and Kylie on that. There is also international precedent for wiping cannabis-related convictions. Canada have built that into their model, and going to what Chloe was talking about, that's what they found, is that they have an opt-in system, and actually the government hasn't committed the resources to it, and so there's actually a very, very slow, laborious process for people to get justice. And so, one, I think we should pick up on that international precedent and push strongly for it here in Aotearoa, but two, if we do, the government actually needs to commit a lot of resource to going through all of the records and actually manually wiping them. Kia ora.
Great. Okay, we've only got a few minutes left, guys. So I'm just going to, there's so much we can talk about, but let's wrap it up. The last one's a challenge. Just try your best, guys. Don't worry if you fudge it. But the provocation is, if you only had a single 30-second ad slot for the entire Yes campaign, what would it be? We'll start with you, Kylie.
I have scripted my 30 seconds.
Good.
Set the timer now. A vote for no is a vote for the status quo. Easy access to cannabis, racist policing, wasted taxpayer dollars on enforcement, and poor outcomes in health and education. A yes vote is a vote for control, legalisation for adult use, controlled product in a regulated market, protections for young people, access for health responses only for those that need it. Vote Yes 2020, reduce harm to people and communities.
So good. What an A student. I had to go after her. So that's you, Ricardo.
Oh God, I do not have a script, and so I'll need you to time me. The truth is that most people are using cannabis right now, have used cannabis at some point in their lifetime, and a vote for no is a vote to keep that use in the dark and for our children growing up without necessary information about drugs they'll encounter over their lifetime. A vote for yes means we can have mature, fact-based conversations about drugs, but it also means that people who do use drugs can use it in a way that is safe for themselves and for the whānau. And so I think, as Jack said, we've got a once-in-a-lifetime generation to change our laws to ensure that we no longer put Māori whānau in prisons. That's my case.
Great, thank you. Moana?
Those are tough acts to
Yes,
follow.
they are.
So I guess we've talked about harm reduction, and you know, harms occur whether or not it's legal, and particularly thinking about young people, the importance in terms of the age restrictions, and the fact that it has been illegal in New Zealand. It hasn't stopped people from using cannabis. We know there's high rates, and those that have been convicted and arrested still continue to use. So I think really we need to focus on, you know, prevention, education. We need to focus focus on early treatment, especially if we're thinking about our rangatahi, and that cannabis really should, based on the research that we've done here in New Zealand, we've done some great research, should be treated as a health issue and not as a criminal issue.
Great. Jack?
I also don't have a scripted 30 seconds, but I'll try my best. So cannabis was criminalized, and the war on drugs came about as a result of explicitly and incredibly racist policies from the United States. A guy called Harry Anslinger, look him up. His quotes are absolutely disgusting as to why they brought in criminalization. So that criminalization is still occurring today to whānau Māori here in Aotearoa with convenience charges, police using cannabis to criminalize our people. So for that reason alone, we should vote yes. We should vote yes so we can actually bring, as Kylie said, cannabis under control. We can start to reduce stigma. We can start to help people who do have mental health challenges. And we should vote yes so that we can actually continue the campaign to end the war on drugs. This won't be the end, but this is an important milestone, and this will enable us to actually continue the campaign to ensure that our communities actually achieve justice and actually have some recompense for the incredible violence that's been done to us through this war. Kia ora.
Right. And finally, Chloe.
Kia ora. I just want to toko what everybody else has said. And
that's it. That's your 30 seconds.
No, but I get a lot of people right. I'm surrounded actually by letters from people that I have to respond to, and a lot of folks send me these letters talking about the harm that cannabis can cause, and they go, look at these statistics, and they actually largely quote Moana's statistics and those that are produced by Joe Bowden, who has also helped to create some of the best data in the world in terms of the negative effects that early excessive cannabis use can have. We know that all of that harm has occurred under the status quo. All of the harm that you are aware of with regard to cannabis use has occurred under this criminalized prohibitionist model. Therefore, it is not working. So I think it's important to recognize, again, the distinction between the substance and the approach that we take to it. Legalization is not liberalization. We are not putting it in slushies. We are not putting it in gummy bears, and we are not throwing it from the rooftops, folks. What we are doing, as Kylie said, is getting a sense of control. So the message to kids here is actually, this is something that should only be used by informed adults. And I think about it similarly to the discussions that we were having about sex education 10 or 20 years ago, when we were like, don't have sex because you will get pregnant and you will die. And lo and behold, a lot of people did get pregnant, didn't die, and we didn't end up with very great social outcomes. Actually, you have the opportunity here to inform people, to educate them, to delay harmful use, and to increase the sense of well-being in our community by decreasing harm. And I just actually Googled it because Jack was referring to it. Some of the quotes are disgusting from those who are actively involved in the campaign for the war on drugs. And here I want to leave you with the words actually of Ehrlichman, who was the main advisor to Richard Nixon during his 1968 campaign. And he said, and I quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You know what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, we could then criminalize them both heavily. We could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did."
Great. Guys, this is amazing. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you. My takeaway is a yes vote is a vote for control. I love that. I'm going to be using that a lot with my family. I'm also fascinated by this Portuguese panel of dissuasion, so I'm going to be researching that as well, I think. So what the hell? I love it. Right, I'm going to pass you over to Joe and Bridget just to wrap up.
Cool, yeah. Thank you so much for coming along. We really appreciate it. Also, apologies to our audience who were tricked by those weird links. We've been trying to delete them all day, but they got through somehow. We just wanted to kind of end things off and say that we do have a Facebook page and a Facebook group where we will be sharing kind of articles, reports, where you can kind of read up and research and try and help inform those discussions. We also have some workshops planned later on the year to kind of help you to have those conversations in your community. So make sure you follow us so that you can get involved with those. But yeah, that's kind of...
Yeah, shout out to all of you guys, and especially you, Tom, as well, for co-hosting with us. Thank you very much. And to Just Speak. Yeah, Just Speak's been a big help backing us as well. So thank you to them.
Emily and Tanya, you are the real MVPs. Thank you for letting us use your Zoom Premium.
Great, awesome. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we stop the? Do we end the live stream?
Kia ora tātou.
Ka kite.
Oh, Maria.
Thank you.